noble beginning. It begins in a quest for meanings that transcend the here and now. These, for me, are not necessarily universal, and certainly have more to say about local conditions than universal ones. I do think we can make historical comparisons. I've been doing that pretty routinely up here. But he thought that these questions had something profoundly important to tell us about what human beings were. Now, one further point that I want to make about Socrates and about the Greek way of life as it will be presented throughout here. And this is by way of sort of distancing myself from a rather standard presentation of Socrates. We now know that what are called the Greeks, and what I've been referring to as the Greeks, we know from the scholarship of African Americans and others that this was largely, and my whole lecture has been based on this text, and I don't mind evoking these Greek values because I think they're still very important, but you should have this note of suspicion, and that's that largely it was 19th century German scholarship that, as it were, invented the Greeks for us. I mean, at one time they were just, you know, like in the 16th century, they were one among other earlier civilizations, you know. The 19th century Germans, I don't know if you know this, were extremely impressed with the Greeks. It's kind of obvious if one looks at their art or reads their literature, right? They were very impressed with the Greeks and what they found out about them. In any case, the Greeks as understood today through that tradition is the only possible topic that I can bring up here. Because in a certain sense, and this is not a relativist argument, the past is only accessible through readings and reinterpretations of the past in the absence of a time machine. I mean, I think that's at the basis of our wonderful time machine fantasy about history, is all of us would kind of like to know what it was really like. You know, what was it really like? The trouble with the past is it's kind of like the present. We don't know. We don't know what it was really like. And a further worry is that even if we had been there, the odds that people who have been socialized to speak an informational language, not to seek these things that are advertising slogans to us, it's very doubtful we'd understand what the hell was going on if we were there. Might sound as peculiar as it does to my students to be forced to read these things. And they say, what the devil is that? All this time talking about beauty, or what is goodness? I mean, good grief. I would like to now make a historical point about something that philosophers today are more aware of than they used to be, and which is important. Not all kinds of inquiry can appear in just any setting. There are conditions for the possibility of certain questions being asked. And in the case of Greek society, they went along with a relatively unproblematic discourse for quite a while, especially during the very high days of their empire, when their empire was really in a secure position. In that social setting and under those social conditions, there was no Socrates and no condition for the possibility of there being one. And here's why. Because in the sort of classic Greek language, the one that comes out of the, you know, the oral tradition of Homer and others, it would be insane to ask something like, what is courage? Because the response, which many of you may have had in the back of your mind as I was speaking, would be, don't you have a dictionary? In other words, we know what it means. We've got a cohesive society. We're unified. It's like about the war now. We're all together on this. We know what courage is. So there would have been no space for the Socratic inquiry. It was only after a rather unpleasant experience in a war, Greek war, someone may know about it, kind of a famous war. Good journalist back then, too. Thucydides, fairly decent journalist. Could have got a job with the Post, probably. But after a tragic experience with the war and a military dictatorship, the words that had become standard in their culture and had been used unproblematically with meanings attaching to definite positions began to be sources of irritation, and so the ground and the possibility for Socrates' inquiry was not really his individual genius, although that itself is is a nice thing, and I'm not against it, but it was not possible except against a background of a society that had deeply begun to question what these words really meant. And one can't help but think, for example, to try to make this parallel come alive, that the radical questioning that's been going on in the universities about the canons of knowledge, the instruments of knowledge, has not been profoundly affected, as Time magazine admits. But no, it's clear that the current struggle over the canon and the meaning of these classic texts, all of which I've selected only classic texts for this course. I'm not going to read them necessarily or discuss them in necessarily a classic way. But the point of all this questioning is that after this country's experience in the 50s and the 60s of both the civil rights movement and anti-war movement, counterculture, and so on, it became again a problem to say, what does it mean to be, for example, a good woman? Well, there was something sort of in 1951 that meant that clearly is a matter of debate now. Okay? Is that clear? Is that a good example? It's pretty clear. Well, I'll pick one that's a little more controversial. What's a patriot? Became a matter of debate. In sort of 1954, it was not all that confusing. And I'm old enough to remember people not being confused by it. I think people want it to be non-confusing again, desperately. They may want it more than they want even money, which is amazing. But the point is that philosophy, philosophical inquiry of the dangerous kind, as opposed to of the analytic, boring, academic kind, philosophic inquiry of the dangerous kind catches a society at a moment when it's insecure about what the main terms that hold it together mean, like man, woman, patriot, and in particular human being. So that is the human edge of philosophy, is that you catch society at a moment of danger when a term or set of terms that are very important to the identity of a lot of people are in question, are possible. The questioning of them is at least possible. It may be that we are today, and since I'm trying to remind myself as I talk about eternal values and not being a relativist, and I do think it's important to search for values that transcend the here and now. On the other hand, in the time since Socrates, we have become more dubious about eternal ones. Me too. We're all more dubious about those. But I would like to look for values that transcend the here and now, and for obvious reasons. The obvious reason in my case being that I think the ones that prevail here and now suck. Good English word, right? So we all know what that means. By the way, it's interesting to note, sidebar here for you amateur philosophers who want to read more books of this kind, most of the texts are translated to get those kind of words out of them. But the language spoken by Socrates, as recorded by Plato, is not a fancy language just filled with technical terms, but is a pretty ordinary Greek. And it's only later, sort of mid-20th century or early 20th century, when philosophy starts to develop a professionalized vocabulary. See, in all its previous history, it tried to communicate with at least some class of people. It's only recently that it tries to communicate with no one. I mean, the Journal of Philosophy, if 12 people go down on the same flight, there won't be any more Journal of Philosophy, because 11 guys write it for this other guy. I mean, that's, you know, so what I'm trying to do today is to broaden out the interest of philosophy a little more than that, to the extent that it means anything more than another niche in an intellectual market